Welcome to Military Analytics. The roar of tank tracks, the loud explosions of missiles and artillery fire, and more continue fiercely on Ukrainian soil as the clashes flare up with the warming of the weather. Images similar to World War II emerge in Ukraine. Both sides seek to seize control of the war before the summer season. But now, with the Ukrainians deploying their special forces to the front lines, we can see the density of the Ukrainian armed forces in most regions. Incredible offensive operations, sudden raids, interception and destruction of convoys by Ukrainian special forces against the Russians have shaken the front lines these days. At the center of the striking offensive operations carried out by Ukraine's special forces was the 3rd Assault Brigade, aka the Azov Regiment. As a result of the Ukrainian Azov Regiment's Kremlin Special Forces Second Attack Battalion and the 59th Motorized Brigade and 55th Artillery Brigade's operations in Bakhmut, 3 Russian convoys were destroyed, which the Russian army claims to have captured. The Ukrainian Special Forces squeezed the Russians from the flanks and managed to break through the front lines. As a result of the successful operations, all 3 Russian detachments were taken prisoner. Let's take a look at the details of the legendary operations of the Ukrainian army. The Azov Regiment Special Forces, which led the Ukrainian offensive in Bakhmut, surrounded the Russian army in Bakhmut from the flanks. Kremlin Special Operations Forces of the 3rd Assault Brigade and the Second Assault Battalion achieved incredible success during the attack on Russian positions on the southern flank of Bakhmut. As a result of the operation organized by the soldiers of the Azov Regiment, the Russian troops were repulsed at a length of 1,730 meters and a depth of 700 meters. The Azov Regiment crushed a large Russian convoy in a perfect ambush. After that, 23 Russian soldiers were killed, and more than 40 Russians were injured. The mission was successfully completed by the soldiers of the Second Assault Battalion of the Azov Regiment. The Kremlin Special Forces of the Azov Regiment also succeeded in breaking through the Russian front lines for 2 kilometers. As a result of the last offensive operations carried out in Bakhmut, Kremlin Special Forces also managed to capture an entire Russian detachment. As a result of this operation, many Russian soldiers from the so-called Stormzy unit of the Russian 72nd Brigade were captured by Azov Guards. One of them was an ex-convict. This prisoner stayed at the front near Bakhmut for 3 days as part of Stormzy's plans. Stormzy assault divisions were formed by the Russian military command as part of certain Russian military units. The Stormzy military command was forming army assault groups, taking into account the experience of leading Wagner PMC assault groups. The principle of the formation of such military units in the Russian army, similar to the Wagner units, included the recruitment of persons from the reformatory. It was claimed that the ex-convict captured by the Ukrainians was also on an important mission in the Stormzy unit. But the soldiers of the Azov Regiment managed to finish the activities of this Russian group before it even started. Units of the Russian 72nd Brigade tried to retake lost positions and were unsuccessful. The Russians were equally compelled to withdraw from these positions. This shock in Bakhmut was only the beginning because the special forces of the Ukrainian army continued to perform in Bakhmut and the surrounding front lines. After the successful operations of the 3rd Separate Assault Brigade, the Azov Regiment and Kremlin on the Bakhmut flanks, there was another special unit from Ukraine, this time on the sea near the city of Pisky in the Donetsk region. Ukrainian soldiers from the 59th Motor Brigade and the 55th Artillery Brigade destroyed a convoy of Russian armored vehicles. As a result of the clash, 5 enemy armored vehicles were destroyed, including 1 tank, 2 BMD-2s, and 2 extremely rare AN 5900 and 951 armored vehicles, with the help of minefields, artillery support, and the FGM-148 Javelin 80GM. In addition, as a result of this striking operation, the Ukrainian forces captured an entire detachment of Russian mercenaries from the Storm Special Military Division in the Donetsk region, and only 7 Ukrainian soldiers managed to capture these Russian soldiers. This detail was quite remarkable. A Ukrainian soldier named Magyar stated that the captured invaders belonged to the Russian Storm PMC unit. With the surrender of weapons and all ammunition, the entire surrender process of the Russian soldiers was videotaped. Images of the mind-blowing offensive operation were published by the Ukrainian military on social networks. Also, according to the Ukrainian soldier named Magyar, all the prisoners were captured and uninjured. according to the norms of warfare, after which they were evacuated from the battlefield. The units of this Russian penal battalion had already distinguished themselves as assault infantry in the battles for solidarity in the Donetsk region. Thanks to the striking offensive operations by Ukraine's special forces, these Russian penal battalions were destroyed one by one on the battlefield. After all these successful operations, Ukrainian Special Operations Forces are still diligently working behind the scenes to prepare the ground for an offensive led by mechanized troops and regular infantry in the months ahead. While shrouded in secrecy and never claimed, there is ample evidence of high-risk operations, including sabotage, drone strikes, and targeted assassinations against high-value targets and collaborators both in the occupied territories and in Russia's border areas. Taken together with Russia's repeated accusations of sabotage in Ukraine's occupied territories and Russia itself, these actions fit the typical way the Ukrainian military special operations forces operate. The examples are too numerous to count. For example, in early May, 2 explosive-laden drones crashed into a military training ground in Russia's Voronezh region, injuring 14 soldiers, and 2 explosions occurred, causing the derailment of logistics trains in the Bryansk region in western Russia. These events were among the most effective examples of mysterious attacks and sabotage against targets, including oil depots, power lines, and military bases, both in occupied Crimea and in the Russian regions bordering Ukraine. Ukrainian special forces are also conducting deep reconnaissance to map the location and movements of Russian military personnel, equipment, and command posts using their language skills and superior training. The personnel of the Ukrainian Army's special forces can easily infiltrate local communities and act behind enemy lines to gather intelligence on the enemy's strengths and weaknesses. These specialist skills were instrumental in successful precision strike campaigns against Russian command and control centers and preparedness areas before Ukraine's counterattacks in the Kharkiv and Kherson regions in September and October, respectively. The work of the special forces of the Ukrainian army is often carried out using unconventional tactics and techniques and includes targeted actions, information, and psychological operations against high-profile enemy officials and the establishment of resistance networks. The operations of prominent pro-Moscow collaborators Vladimir Tatarsky and Zakhar Pryalpin in Russia may have been carried out by pro-Ukrainian Russian citizens trained and supported by Ukrainian special forces. At the same time, various elite Ukrainian units conduct attacks against Russian positions using first-person drones and military ammunition, often in cooperation with other branches of the armed forces. This common dimension is critical in modern warfare, as it not only improves the overall coordination for the fighting force but also increases its effectiveness and flexibility. In summary, the special forces of the Ukrainian army are actually waiting behind the scenes as the invisible heroes of the battlefield when the time is right. These special units take the stage and do what is necessary. On the other hand, most of Russia's special forces have been destroyed on the Ukrainian front lines since the beginning of the war, as the Russians drove their special forces to the battle lines in an impromptu and unscheduled way. The field now fell to the Ukrainian army's special units and elite military groups. The Ukrainian army continues to block the Russian forces. This time, the Russian troops were put in a difficult situation in Crimea. Russia, which has stopped the occupation of new regions, is losing its territories one by one. The people of Crimea stand with Ukraine. People who refuse to accept Russian rule in Crimea have taken to the streets. Russia is about to be forced to surrender Crimea to Ukraine. Ukraine has taken all the power in its hands with the operation it organized. Years after the unjust occupation of Crimea, Ukraine still hopes to take the territory under its rule. The biggest reason for this is that the people in Crimea are also very much against Russian rule. The vast majority of the people of Crimea will support the expulsion of Russians from these lands. Support Ukraine in this process. Nevertheless, Russia, which has not given up on Crimea, is trying to maintain order in Crimea while trying to continue the war within Ukraine's borders. It is seen that the Russian army, which is constantly attacked by the attacks, is no longer sufficient for all these regions at once. The Russian government, which has been under pressure due to the riots and protests, is very afraid of the possibility of Crimea being taken away from them in these last days when we see Ukraine's power increasing day by day. The fact that Russia cannot find any support creates a pessimistic atmosphere on the soldiers. For this reason, the Ukrainian army has turned the state of despair in Russia's favor. The Ukrainian army, which wants to physically force the Russian soldiers who are in a psychologically bad situation, has shaped its work in this direction with these efforts. The Ukrainian army prevented the Russian soldiers from meeting their needs, both at the front and in the headquarters, giving the soldiers a very difficult time. The delivery trucks full of supplies and ammunition that were trying to be delivered to the regions were detected and blown up one by the Ukrainian army. It is estimated that the material damage caused in Russia by these supplies to the regions has reached incredible proportions. Seeing the difficulties that Russia had fallen into, the Ukrainian army decided that it was the right time to take advantage of this difficulty and directed its attacks towards Crimea. In this way, Russia's power, which started to be financially challenged, began to break in Crimea. Taking advantage of the fact that the Russian army started to lose its power, the Ukrainian army pressed the button for much larger operations. With these operations, the Ukrainian army attacked the ammunition depots and headquarters of the Russian army, causing Russia's budget deficits to grow. The Russian army, which is constantly trying to replace what it has lost, has therefore failed to make any progress both in Crimea and in other regions. Having halted plans to occupy new territories, Russia was having difficulty even protecting what it had. Although Russia was particularly worried about Crimea, it was still vulnerable in the region because the exhausted army fighting in many regions at the same time was not able to fully control any region. What happened on the Taurida Highway, which was built a while ago to facilitate transportation between Sevastopol and Simferopol, shocked the whole world. The whole world thinks that this incident is the clearest demonstration of Russia's loss of power. There was a hotel in the area where the soldiers involved in the construction of this highway stayed while carrying out their duties for unknown reasons. A huge fire broke out in the hotel, but in fact, it was known that it was an assassination by the Ukrainian army against Russian soldiers. Nevertheless, Russia refused to accept this and claimed that the fire was caused by natural causes. The reason for this was that the acceptance of this attack by Ukraine meant the acceptance of its power. Russia is blaming Ukraine for everything that went wrong in the domestic and international environment and had reached a discrediting level. Russia, feeling humiliated against other states, suddenly started to pursue the opposite policy and began to cover up the operations. These successful operations in Ukraine were also affecting the public's attitude towards Putin. Russian leader Vladimir Putin, who cannot tolerate being seen as a weakened leader, is making a special effort to cover up all these events. Despite Russia's denials, the information that the hotel was the victim of arson continued to spread. As a result, the fire organization in Crimea took full responsibility for the incident. And once again, the situation was thrown into confusion. Although this organization has been known to carry out many actions for a long time, it was not expected that it could be responsible for such a major action. This organization, which emerged as a resistance organization at the beginning of the occupation and gradually grew, has now become the fearful dream of Russian soldiers in the region. It is known that this organization initially emerged to protect minority rights due to the fact that Russian citizens who were forcibly included in the army due to the shortage of soldiers were selected, especially from the minority group. Russia had a great reaction. The organization, which started by organizing protests due to Russia's disregard for the lives of the citizens, was the cause of many explosions in the country over time. It is also seen that as the Ukrainian army gets stronger, these organizations get stronger and cause more damage. War analysts say that if Russia fails to stop these organizations as soon as possible, the damage will be too much for them to cope with. The rebellions in Crimea, due to the forced involvement of citizens in the war, were not limited to these. It is known that many protests organized not only by organizations but also by civilians pose a danger to Putin's regime. For this reason, Putin, who panicked, followed a very wrong policy again, instead of calming the citizens. Putin gave unlimited power to the troops assigned to these protests, causing injuries to citizens. It is known that the Russian army, which did not receive the necessary care in this war between Russia and Ukraine, which lasted much longer than expected, is in a very exhausted state. For a long time, it was thought that the soldiers were almost self-sabotaging, but recently it was learned that what the soldiers were doing was actually sabotage. Those who could escape from the Russian soldiers who were tired of fighting for leaving their posts. It is also known that there were even commanders who surrendered to the Ukrainian army. While the soldiers are counting the days until the end of the war, the constant moves to prolong the war are causing the soldiers to burn out. Many commanders do not want to bear the burden of conscience of sending the soldiers they are responsible for to their deaths every day. The fact that the commanders are constantly pressuring the government to end the war and getting no response to their demands is slowly driving things out of control. For this reason, the rebellions in the army could not be stopped, and the Russian army is getting weaker and weaker. Think that it is not possible to fight an army with such a low quality of soldiers. The Ukrainian army continues to increase its pressure day by day. At the same time, the Russian government, which has to deal with both internal and external disturbance, seems to be unable to withstand these pressures any longer. The opposition parties in Russia can also foresee the great defeats that the Russian army will suffer in Ukraine. For this reason, opposition party members say that Russia should withdraw before it is completely expelled from Ukrainian territory. But all of Russia knows that the dictatorial leader will continue to pursue these policies as long as he remains in power. For this reason, the Russian authorities, who are focused on removing Putin from power, have taken action in line with their wishes. It is thought that the opposition parties, which have the support of the people behind them, may have a say in power in a short time if the policies implemented continue to be carried forward in this way. The reign of Vladimir Putin, who has taken away the freedom of the people, will not last long. In the center of the clashes in Ukraine, all the balances started to change. In the city of Bakhmut, the gates of hell, the Ukrainian armed forces had finally managed to blockade the city from the north and south. At Kremlin, about 24 kilometers northwest of the city, the Ukrainians engaged artillery and infantry units to provide support to Bakhmut's northern line. The highway here is critical for Ukrainian forces to provide military logistics to Bakhmut. The military efforts of the Ukrainians in the south of the city were quite remarkable. In the city of Ivanovsky, on the southwestern flank of Bakhmut, Ukrainian forces controlled wooded areas and trench lines. In the city of Khersavier, 15 kilometers west of Bakhmut, Ukrainian forces continued to approach the city from this direction for a long time. The Ukrainian armed forces, with support from Kremlin, Ivanovsky, and Shasarvar, managed to create a network of attacks in Bakhmut. The latest events on the Bakhmut front line also contributed to the expansion of this network of attacks by the Ukrainians. The Wagner Group, which fought for the invasion plans of Moscow, as well as the Russian army, announced that it would withdraw from the city. In the past few days, Wagner leader Yevgeny Prigozhin reported that Bakhmut had withdrawn his mercenaries from his flanks and retreated to the city's central front lines. In this way, the Ukrainian forces were able to besiege Bakhmut from the north, south, and even the west. In other words, after Commander Prigozhin's withdrawal move, the Ukrainians were able to respond harshly to Russian leader Vladimir Putin's invasion plans. Ukrainian forces eased their offensive operations in the north and south of the city, with Wagner's forces withdrawing from the center of Bakhmut. The Russians failed to anticipate that this was a tactic, and that the Ukrainians would turn their offensive axis in a different direction because with the withdrawal of the Wagner Group mercenaries, Russian offensive operations in and around the city were greatly reduced. Ukrainian military officials reported that Russian offensive operations in the direction of Bakhmut fell dramatically into two clashes. Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister Hanna Malior attributed this decline to Russia's on-site relief and regrouping of forces in the region. However, in a surprise counterattack, the Ukrainian forces repulsed the Russian forces from the trench lines in the center line and south of the city of Bakhmut and recaptured a number of buildings in the city. At a press conference held at the G7 summit in Hiroshima, Japan, Minister Malior stated that Bakhmut was not occupied by the Russian Federation. The fact that the Ukrainian forces recaptured large areas of buildings in the center and south flanks of the city and repulsed the Russians confirmed the statements of the Ukrainian authorities. The head of the Ukrainian ground forces, Oleksandr Kursky, reported that the Kiev forces continued defensive operations in the city and had ambiguous successes in the city's suburbs against the advance of the Ukrainian forces. The Russians carried out a series of unsuccessful offensive attempts in and around Bakhmut. The Ukrainian General Staff reported that Russian forces conducted unsuccessful offensive operations west of Kromov and in the direction of protection, 15 kilometers southwest of Bakhmut. Even the bloggers who supported Moscow after the failed attempts made statements that the efforts of the Russian army were insufficient and useless. Prominent Russian male bloggers claimed that Ukrainian forces did not conduct active operations aimed at regaining Russian positions in Bakhmut city, despite the possibility of continued local Ukrainian counterattacks in the northwest and southwest of the city. In fact, that was exactly the case for a long time. Russian President Vladimir Putin, seeking a symbol of victory, did not accept the advance of Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut. If the Ukrainians manage to completely clamp the Russians in the city of Bakhmut, they will likely begin to focus on the southern front lines, Crimea, and the regions of southern Ukraine. Crimea can be considered Kiev's next offensive axis. For now, violent offensive operations continue in both regions. If you remember when the directions of the clashes shifted from next to the south of Ukraine, there were major attacks in the city of Mariupol. It was understood in these attacks that the Ukrainians would gradually focus on the southern front. These days after Donbass, because the Ukrainian armed forces hit the Russian airbase in Mariupol using Storm Shadow long-range missiles. While this incredible offensive operation shook the Russians, the Ukrainian forces continued their offensive operations with Crimea. The peninsula city of Zanki was the scene of drone attacks. The Ukrainians targeted this city using 7 Mugan 5 drones. Russian officials in Crimea claimed that these drones were destroyed and everything returned to normal in the city. But the purpose of the Ukrainians here was to determine whether the Russian air defense systems had undergone any location changes, because the Ukrainian forces used the cost-effective Mugan 5 UAVs to detect Russian air defense systems in Crimea. In addition, after all this, the leader of the Wagner Group made striking statements about the events in the city of Bakhmut and the possible outcome of the war in Ukraine. The head of the Wagner Group acknowledged that Russia lost more than 40% of its private mercenaries in the battle for the besieged city of Bakhmut in eastern Ukraine. In his final tirade against the Kremlin, Commander Yevgeny Prigozhin reported that his strength had lost 20,000 of its 50,000 fighters. This figure was in stark contrast to Moscow's widely disputed claims that just over 6,000 of its soldiers had been killed in combat as of January. Analysts have long suspected that the fight for Bakhmut alone cost the lives of tens of thousands of soldiers, both Russian and Ukrainian. But Commander Prigozhin's words represent the first public recognition of great losses. The claims of the Wagner leader seem to be talked about for a long time. On the other hand, Ukrainian forces are heavily fortifying the nearby cities of Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. As Wagner and Russian forces sacrificed hundreds of thousands of shells, as well as tens of thousands of lives in human wave attacks while attempting to take Bakhmut. In addition, the Russian leader did not intend to withdraw his forces from Bakhmut. Despite all these negative situations, on the contrary, President Putin recklessly used both his own army and Wagner forces in every direction of the city in order to get Bakhmut completely. However, these risky moves of President Putin may create great advantages for the Ukrainian army in the coming days. Clashes continue not only on the eastern Ukrainian front lines but also in the southern parts of the country. In summary, Ukrainians continued their struggle for freedom from all sides. The clashes that started in Donbass swept through Crimea and southern Ukraine. When we evaluate all these events, it seems that Kiev's great offensive plans will continue. We will see what will happen in the coming days. Thank you for watching us.